It's buy low time for week 5 on the pod. Get yourself fired up to go make some deals and squeeze out some extra value. Welcome, one and all, to Fantasy NBA Today. I am your host, Dan Besbris. Thanks, as always, for hanging out with us. This was seemingly a pretty big hit last week, so we're going to do another buy low segment after we had a few that cashed in almost right away, actually. Brook Lopez, probably the largest of the names on last week's buy low list that rocketed up the board. He's now number 38 in 9cat after sitting in the 90s last week. That type of jump, well, doesn't usually happen in 1 week, but we just knew because the field goal percent is now up to 45 instead of 39. The blocks have held steady. The free throw percent is up to 79 instead of in the low 70s. And these little things, even without a ton of extra usage, we knew would shift bodies up the board. And those are just the types of guys that we're going to be looking for here on today's episode. Please, before we dive into all the names on the list, I think I have 5 of them, including a couple of repeat offenders that we might even be able to get one of them cheaper, one of them actually slightly more expensive. Before we dive into the names on today's board, please, everybody, take just 2 seconds to flick at that like button, that subscribe button, however you're taking in this podcast. Subscriptions go a long, long way. So come on over, hang out with us a bit more permanently. Find me on social media at Dan Besbris, DanBesbris, or just Google search Dan from Sports Ethos or Dan from Hoopball, and you guys can find me just fine over there. Let's get to the names on the board. Here it is, the buy low list for week 5. I know this sort of remedial PowerPoint presentation that you guys get to look at, but at least the graphics are clear. Name number 1 is a repeat offender from last week. It's Jaren Jackson Jr., who showed a couple signs of life over the last week, but overall his rank actually dropped, believe it or not, mostly because his field goal percent dropped. The other stuff held fairly steady week over week, but his field goal percent is down to now 43.2%. His defensive stats have remained at half of what they were last year. Half. And that's a big drop for someone whose value was fairly well tied up in defensive stats. Remember, last season, JJJ was at 3 blocks per game. Very, very good. 1 steal per game for a big man power forward center. Also very good. This year, 1.6 blocks, basically cut in half. Steals, 0.5, almost exactly cut in half. Field goal percent is down from 50.5 to 43, as we mentioned, which, again, I don't know that we can necessarily guarantee the field goal percent comes back because last year was the more anomalous number for him. He had never been up in that stratosphere while also being a guy who took a bunch of 3-pointers. So let's assume, for argument's sake, that JJJ does not get his field goal percent back up. I still think we can assume that the defensive stats loop around a little bit, maybe not all the way to 4 per game. This was sort of the, like, why would you draft someone like that in the first round whose value is so heavily tied in one category? But even if it gets back to some fraction of it, instead of a half or less, which is what we're sitting on right now, is almost right around 50%, you've got to figure that those blocks and steals come up a little bit, especially because his minutes are actually the biggest they've ever been. So even if the rate comes down, the how many minutes, how many opportunities he has on the floor comes up. And it's also possible, by the way, that when Ja Morant comes back, this team might actually utilize him for what he's good at more. Maybe you don't need to take so many shots. Maybe you don't need to be more this volume guy. And we may be seeing an instance of, it doesn't happen very often, usage does not equate to value. It almost always does, 90, 95% of the time. But 1 out of every 10, 1 out of every 15 or 20 players, it's actually better when they're doing less. And JJJ may be turning out to be one of those guys. So on the board, his current 9-cat season rank is in the 60s, depending on what board you're looking at. 64 on some, 65, 66 on others. That's generally the range right now. I still think that if his defensive stats get back to some range around what we're hunting, he can still get up into the second round. And maybe we could even say, if we want to say top 30 instead of top 24, that's also probably fair. The nice thing about JJJ is because he didn't really make any progress over the last 7 days, you can probably get him for a little bit cheaper now. Where last week we talked about picking him up for like a 30 to 35 range guy. This week you can probably try throwing out someone maybe near 40. And it's going to have to be a big name near 40. DeJounte Murray is at 41. That's a big name near 40. Miles Turner at 43 is a similar player to JJJ. Maybe you can try to flip one for the other if somebody's annoyed that Miles isn't getting maximum minutes right now. It may change your team makeup a little bit, but someone like an Alperen Şengün who's scoring a lot of points, but I don't think folks have really noticed that he and JJJ are scoring within like 1 point of each other. Şengün's advantage over Jaren Jackson is largely in the assists department, but I don't think he's catching him in defensive stats anytime soon. Nick Claxton, who is going to be a big-time defensive stats guy, but he's going to wear your free throw percent down. Maybe not a big enough name, but someone you could consider. Someone like a Jalen Brunson who's working his way up the board. He was a little bit of a buy low recently, but now he's kind of worked his way back into closer to where we assume he's going to be, maybe still a little bit below that mark. But these are some of the guys you can see in that range that drive the name value in a way where it might be able to get you Jaren Jackson Jr. The other repeat name on the board, and this one is a guy who actually got more expensive. I wanted to put two names that I thought you could still maybe squeeze a couple of bucks out of. JJJ's the sort of easier repeat offender, and then Freddie VanVleet is the other one who actually has moved up the board. Although his very poor shooting night yesterday in a loss at Golden State moved him back down a tiny bit. So the numbers on your screen are actually not perfectly accurate. He was 50 before last night when I was making up these panels for the show. He's now 54. So, whatever. Doesn't change things all that much. He's at 38% shooting, which we know is probably going to come up to 39 or 40, but not change all that much. Everything else with VanVleet parallels or even improves upon what he was doing in Toronto, with the exception of one category. And it's the same thing we talked about last week. Steals. And over the last 7 days, he hasn't really added any steals. He's still at only 0.6 per ball game. And sure, we can assume that because the Rockets are playing more of a position-based defense, guys are not going to be gambling as much. But Freddie VanVleet has always been near the top of the league in deflections, and that's the kind of thing that even a team that's going for more positional defense is still going to value. By the way, he's ranked 48th on the Yahoo board, and he's 55th on the Basketball Monster board. So, again, we can kind of average out the in-between. But Freddie VanVleet, basically, since he's cleared 30 minutes in an NBA game, which is like 4 or 5 years ago, he's been more in the 1.7 to 1.9 steals range. Early in his Toronto career, he played 20 minutes. He had 0.9 steals. But even then, you're looking at a rate that was more like 1.5 to 2 steals per game. And this year would be his lowest since his very first season, where he played 8 minutes a game. And if you're thinking, Dan, maybe it's age. No, I don't think so. He's only 29 years old. He's not past his prime yet, even if you think he's maybe a year on the wrong side of it or whatever. You're not going to see this kind of erosion, especially while he's posting career bests in assists right now. And he's only taking one less shot per game than last year. Career 40% shooter. His shot profile is not all that different year over year. I would expect his field goal percent to tick up just the littlest bit. And the steals, that's the big one. And, again, it doesn't seem like a really big deal, but one extra steal already for VanVleet, you're talking about an extra 12 on the season, and that's enough to maybe win you 2 or 3 of your weekly matchups right now. So this starts to compile. It starts to add up over the whole year. It's why these low volume stats like steals and blocks and even 3-pointers to some degree, where one makes a really big difference. It doesn't sound like that much. One sounds small, but the difference between half a steal and 1.5 steals from your guy, that's multiple rounds of rank-related value. So Freddie VanVleet still in that 50 range or a 47 to 60 range, again, depending on what board you're looking at. I still think it should be pretty easy for him to get inside the top 40 once the steals come around. Maybe you could even hunt higher than that in terms of what do you think his final number is going to look like. And I think right now you could get him for an equally ranked player. So someone else in the late 40s to early 50s that maybe you've seen settle in a way that we know Freddie VanVleet hasn't settled yet. The great leveling has not taken effect on him. Now, would I use the same types of guys as JJJ? No, I don't think you needed to go as expensive with VanVleet. I think people value JJJ more if they're selling him because they drafted him probably inside the top 20, whereas VanVleet was going, mid to late 30s. So right now, honestly, he's not even that far behind where he was getting drafted. But I still think if you look at someone like a DeAndre Ayton, who's 45th, or Jalen Johnson, who's 44th, these guys that we think might have some slippage over the next little bit, even a Nick Claxton, who we just talked about, although he probably continues to work his way up the board as the minutes come around. So perhaps that's not the best move. You're going to need somebody who you think is leveled off. Clint Capella is probably leveled off. That's probably not enough to get it done. Jalen Duren, when he comes back, if he posts a giant rebounding game, that might be one to look at. Zach LaVine, there's almost no way he catches VanVleet, but there's a lot of name power there, and he scores a lot. There are a few names that I think could get it done. I'd be careful not to overpay. Jalen Brunson, he's still on his way up. We just talked about that, so maybe not the best pairing there. Mark Williams in Charlotte is having a monster of a season. Maybe that's an interesting one to throw out there, but people probably don't trust it. If Tyler Hero wasn't hurt, he would have been actually a really good one to throw out there. Cam Thomas, while hurt, might be a good one to throw out there because I don't think he shoots 48% on eye volume for the year. I think that probably turns into a number that hurts you. But those are a couple of names we might be able to get for Freddie to get Freddie VanVleet. Let's get into the new names now on today's show. I got 3 new ones for you guys. Jalen Williams of the Thunder is the first new name on the list. He's currently ranked a 97th on the 9CAT board, depending on what site you're looking at. 88th on Basketball Monster, so somewhere between 88 and 100 is sort of the consensus spot for Jalen Williams right now. He was drafted around 55 or 60, and I still think that's the target for him. Because the beauty of Jalen Williams right now is that, like Freddie VanVleet, everything is right where it needs to be, except for one category. And it's the same one as VanVleet. Last year, Jalen Williams over the entire season shot 52%. This year, 52%. Last year, late in the season, when he was posting gigantic numbers, he was taking about 12 or 13 shots per game. This year, he's taking about 12-ish shots per game. So, the differences are minimal. In fact, when he was a top 30 play, the second half of last year, he was at 16.5 points, 5 boards, 4 assists, which, again, look at his numbers right now, 17.5 points, 4 boards, 3.5 assists. Really not all that far off. Late last year when he was surging, he was at 1.2 3-pointers. He's at 1.1 right now. His percentages were 53 and 85. This year, as we mentioned, 52 and 88. The big difference, again, late last year, he was at 2.2 combined defensive stats, 1.8 steals and 0.4 blocks. So far this year, he's at 1. That's the difference. It's basically the only difference for him. His turnovers are a little higher. He's at 1.7 late last year, and he's at over 2 this season, but that's a small little blip that might even work itself out. It's the steals, and even a little bit the blocks. This is a guy who's playing more minutes this year. He's doing more stuff. The steals are going to come around. He's a terrific fantasy basketball player who's just not hitting his mark so far because he's at 0.8 steals, which is like Freddie VanVleet, almost a full steal lower than where he was during a big run late last year. And I don't know that he's going to get to 1.8 or 2 steals per game. It's very hard to maintain numbers that high, but I think we can safely assume he's going to get into the low to mid ones. So 1.2 to 1.5, somewhere in that neck of the woods. We're 13 games into the season. It really only takes 1 or 2 bigger steals games. Run into a Russell Westbrook or something and get 3 or 4 steals. Bingo, bango. You're basically back where you need to be in less than a week. I think he's a really easy buy low candidate because we know he's going to slowly work his way up the board, and he's been extremely productive even without the steals. So I still think he can get into the top 55 range where he was getting drafted. And I think right now you might be able to get him for somebody with some name power around 70. Who would that be potentially? I wouldn't go for somebody who's sort of lagging in the 70s. And the guys with big names there are maybe not the easiest to move. Ausar Thompson is one that has a ton of buzz. because he got off to that crazy start, but his defensive stats have been coming back down to where we kind of assumed that they would. Crazy, crazy start. D'Angelo Russell might get it done, not after a very slow ball game, which he had last time, but after he puts up his next big one. Keldon Johnson's been scoring a lot. That might get it done, even though we know he's going to likely peter out as the Spurs get healthy, as just the world takes its toll. Sorry, one coughing fit per show is sort of where I'm at these days. What other names might get it done? You could go farther up the board, I guess. I don't know that I would do like a DeMar. To me, that feels like you're overpaying. Zach LaVine, these guys are all in this nebulous, gross little Spurs land. Chris Paul is inside the top 60. Some of that is because Draymond's been out. Maybe that would get it done. Maybe he might be overpaying a tiny bit there. But Jalen Williams is gonna move forward. And I like us all to be a part of it when it happens. Next name, we're down to our last two. Jarrett Allen, which, again, this one feels like a pretty easy one because much like with Jalen Williams, there's almost nothing that we actually need to fix with him. These are the buy lows that are just like jumping off the page. Last year, Jarrett Allen, who, like, look, he was fine last year. He wasn't a break the bank kind of guy, but he put up top 40 numbers. And how did he get there? Well, last year he shot 64.5%. This year he's at 63.5%. Is that different? No, not really. Last year, he took 3.5 free throws a game. This year he's at 5. So he's been a bigger negative there without really changing much of his actual game profile. Is that likely to come back where it usually is? I would assume so. You know, he's not really been a 5 free throw guy before. In Cleveland, he was at 4 and then 3 and change. I don't see a big reason why that should change much unless he just got a way better at getting fouled year over year, which seems unlikely. Steals are a little low. Blocks are a little high right now. Those things will one will come up, one will come a little bit down. Maybe blocks could actually stay at 1.4 because he's done 1.6 before. Turnovers, fine. Assists, actually slightly better. The issue for Jarrett Allen right now is he's not getting as many shots as usual, and he's not getting as many rebounds as usual. But the reasons are pretty obvious. He's not getting the same minutes as usual because we were told 2 weeks ago he's on an indefinite minutes cap. At some point, indefinite typically becomes defined, a definite minutes cap, or doesn't exist. At some point, he's just going to get turned loose. And we're really close to it right now because his last 2 games, he's played 32.5 minutes and 29 in a couple of wins for Cleveland, a team that's been coming on, not surprisingly, since Jarrett Allen got healthy. They've been better. Their defense is way better when he's out there. People are like, oh, what if Evan Mobley just takes his job? He's not gonna. They like Mobley at the 4. They like Jarrett Allen at the 5. They like running a defense where they have sort of a backup rim protector at all times. So no one's ever getting any easy shots against them. And so the last 3 games now, his minutes per game is up around 30 instead of 27. Does that mean the usage is going to go back up exactly where it was last year? No, that's not a guarantee, but we are seeing Donovan Mitchell's missing games here and there. Darius Garland's missing games here and there. Karis LeVert is missing games here and there. There's enough available for even a lower usage guy like Jarrett Allen to go out there and get, 8 shots per game instead of maybe we want him up at 9. But even if there's erosion, that's the other part of this. Even if there's erosion, he still shouldn't have any problem blowing past where he's at right now because right now his numbers are built on this low minutes that he's been getting. So I've set my target for Jarrett Allen at top 65 or higher. That feels like a pretty attainable number for him. He's currently ranked 115, which is absurd. I think you can probably get Jarrett Allen for somebody in the 80 to 90 range. I put 85 to 90 on the YouTube graphic, but maybe you have to go a tiny bit higher than that. It's going to have to be somebody with a little bit of name power, as always. That's the way you get things done on trades. So who's in there that we don't think is going a ton higher? Devin Vassell, a high-scoring guy who I think is generally being overrated because of the scoring. That probably gets it done. If Terry Rozier was healthy, that would probably be a name that I'd throw out there. Franz Wagner, he's out. He's right at 100, but people see the 18.5 points per game, and they like that type of stuff. These are guys that actually, like, if they're scoring, they probably get it done. Would I go as high as Keldon Johnson? Yeah, I think I would. I think I would. I know he's at 78, so maybe that's just outside of our buy range, but I think I would do it. Dennis Schroeder in Roto, I think I would give up. I know he's at 16 points and 7 assists. Those are hard to find, but if you can afford to drop the assists, you're going to get a guy who likely blows past Schroeder at some point this year. Mitchell Robinson is not a terrible choice, although he's also actually kind of on the way up. So maybe you hold off and don't spend him on somebody. If someone's annoyed with Daniel Gafford's minutes in Washington, or if you're annoyed with his minutes, that's a guy you might be able to throw out there. Denny Avdia, who doesn't have name power, but he's been sort of safely in that 80 range so far this year. A lot of options that could get you Jared Allen. I think you take a shot, see if you can get him. Last name on the board for this week, OG Anobi. I almost missed him when I was making up my list because I couldn't believe that he was down as far as he was. He's ranked number 97 on some boards, and on others he's 94. Call it between 90 and 100 because all the boards are, they like in that range. Everybody is so similar. There's like, it doesn't really matter. The beauty of OG Anobi is, like some of the other players we've talked about on this list, we just don't need that many things to change for him to get back where he needs to be. I don't think there's any chance he gets back where he was last year. Last year, he was at 2.6 combined defensive stats in his career. He'd never been above 2.2 before that. This year, he's at 1.9. But the other issues year over year, and this is the really silly one, he's shooting 62% at the free throw line. I just see absolutely no reason why that number is going to hold. So I expect OG's steals to come up because his minutes have been kind of artificially low due to blowouts and an injury. He missed a couple of games earlier this week, late last week. But the threes are where we need them to be. They're actually up a tiny bit. Field goal percent looks good. Rebounds a little bit down. Again, that's just because he's been on the floor about 3 to 4 minutes less per game so far this season. Assists are fine. In fact, they might end up good once his minutes get into the 33, 34 range, the way we expect them to. Steals will creep up as the minutes creep up. Turnovers will too, but, who cares? And then you're looking at basically replicating last year, even if he doesn't get all the way up to 84% at the foul line, which was anomalously high for him. He's been more of a mid to high 70s guy since he's settled into a starter's role. That's still like 16% higher than where he's at right now. OG Anobi, what is it going to take, though? Somebody drafted him probably near 50. I think he gets inside the top 65 without almost any problem at all. Moving 2.5, 3 rounds from where he is here is super easy. The free throws alone would probably take care of that. And then any growth in points, rebounds, or steals would push him higher. I think you can get him for someone in the same range as basically what we just talked about. Look at those guys that are in the 75 to 90 range that have some buzz around their name. I detest Brandon Ingram's fantasy game. He's probably someone who ticks up a little bit, but I'd be trying to get out from Brandon Ingram because when that team is healthy, he's not going to be a top 50, top 60 guy. And this is what I yelled about all preseason long. Let's see. Drew Holiday, I was kind of low on this year in that Celtics spot. Maybe you could move off of him and switch him for a different guy who does similar stuff. Who the hell did we just talk about? Keldon Johnson, Denny Avdia, Kyle Kuzma would be interesting. He just had a 12 assist ball game yesterday, so his name is super buzzy right now. Couldn't even mute my mic in time to cover that cough up. OG's a guy I think you should be moving on quickly, and he's probably my favorite buy low on the board. That's why I saved him for last, because I wanted him to also be the graphic on today's show. You guys probably noticed that. He was also the graphic on today's show, and he is our strongest buy and also the last one on the list. We're not doing any questions on this. Remember the buy lows and the sell highs. This is just the info being thrown right in your face. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. These are guys I think you can go get at a slight discount where there's still an opportunity to get value above what you're paying to acquire them. That's the key for a buy low. You're never going to get a name guy the way that we're talking about here. You're never going to get a name guy for what they're actually ranked in this moment. You're going to have to pay a little above their current rank, but hopefully creating a buffer between what you pay and where you think they ultimately end up. That is how you pull off a buy low. Don't undershoot on these folks. You're going to upset the person with them. You got to go with a name that you think really has a shot, piques their interest, and that's the way they'll know you're serious. Take a moment again, please like, subscribe. It goes a very long way. Find me on social. You really got to do that. That's maybe the most important part. It's at Dan Vespers over on Twitter. We do a whole lot of work on all of this stuff over there. Polls, other buys, other sells that sort of pop up quickly. We'll hit all that stuff over on social media. Coming up in a couple hours later today, we'll have another show. We'll break down the Monday card, do a little recap stuff, kind of get you resettled for the Tuesday evening. It's NBA Cup night, Tuesday, Friday action. I am Dan Vespers. This is a special bonus episode of Buy Low Fantasy NBA Today. A Sports Ethos presentation. Head to sportsethos.com and Ethos Fantasy BK to get all of your fantasy basketball news. I'll see you guys in a little bit, couple hours. Later.